Welcome to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry. In every episode, we explore how people from educators and artists to executives and entrepreneurs lead with authenticity, rise through adversity, and share the wisdom they've gained along the way. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Heidi Ridley, a 35-year veteran of the financial services industry and a leader who has made her mark across asset management, sustainability, and global executive leadership. Heidi co-founded and served as CEO and chair of Radiant Global Investors, an asset management boutique that brought a fresh perspective to active equity strategies. Before that, she was global chief executive of Rosenberg Equities at AXA Investment Managers, where she spearheaded the firm's pioneering ESG integration. Beyond her career, Heidi is a passionate advocate for financial literacy, mentoring women in finance and technology, and advancing diversity and inclusion in leadership. Heidi, welcome to Expressions of Leadership. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Michele. It's great to be reconnected.
Now, Heidi, let's start at the very beginning. What first sparked your interest in finance and what drew you to asset management?
My interest in finance was sparked early by my father, who really tried to teach me the value of money and, believe it or not, building credit at a pretty young age. But also a seventh grade English teacher who gave us a project that involved picking a job out of a hat and then building a budget so that we could live within those means. But the reality is that really growing up, my family navigated a lot of ups and downs financially. My father lost everything in the Iranian Revolution, and the resulting struggles sort of triggered a strong determination in me to be financially independent. So I've been working in some fashion really since my early teens in a paper route. But I worked at a restaurant during college to pay for school, and I juggled 3 jobs after graduation to pay for student loans. So when I stumbled into literally a career in asset management, I was really drawn to that idea that you could pursue a career really focused on helping people achieve financial stability and independence. So that was really the hook for me.
When you were at Rosenberg Equities, you led the way in ESG, environmental, social, and governance integration. What inspired you to champion sustainability long before it became mainstream? And how did you bring others along?
Yeah, I mean, standing here today, we can look back on what I think is now well over a decade of ESG sort of being part of our industry. Early on, the focus was really on getting a certain number to look right. So having a good MSCI score or demonstrating that your portfolio has low carbon exposure, whatever the metric is. But I became pretty disenchanted with that approach because, first of all, as a quant, it's sort of hard to boil a variety of attributes down into one number. And B, it doesn't necessarily lead to a better investment. So it became very important for us to emphasize sustainability as being part of what can lead to a company having enduring economic value. So to be in a position to fully assess all of the potential threats and opportunities a company might face and evaluating them as a possible investment that can yield, positive results for your clients. So the conversation internally and externally was really emphasizing that we were just looking for good investments. This isn't a tree hugging exercise as much as I love trees. It's about trying to identify the winners of the future that are incorporating a sustainability assessment is more about bringing insights to the table that can help you capture opportunities or mitigate risk. A big part of it for me personally was obviously about how we did it from an investment standpoint and advocating for the importance of just knowing more about the companies in which we're investing. But it was also about making sure that it did not come off as marketing spin, which was pretty prevalent in the industry. So to promote this authenticity, integrity in everything we do, there can be effectively no daylight between what you believe and implement in your process and what you communicate to clients. So I needed to make sure we walked out of that room with full alignment on what we were doing so that we could speak with the same level of conviction about it to all, potential investors. So it was a process, but I think it brought us to a really solid place.
And after 2 decades in large institutions, you
Mhm.
went on to co-found Radiant Global Investors. What motivated you to take that leap into entrepreneurship? And what did that experience teach you?
Um, wow, the motivation was a combination of frustration and inspiration. So, I think the reality is that to build something, my sense is that in many cases, you have to feel like what you're doing isn't working or isn't working as well as it could be. There's a problem you're trying to solve for. And after you've worked for others and in the weeds for some firms, you're going to have, I think, a fairly clear idea of what you believe works and doesn't. And at some point, I think many of us are faced with that question of going out and doing it on your own or being this agent of positive change within an existing organization, which I had been for a long time. And I feel like I'm a pretty thoughtful risk taker, and one who definitely embraces change as something positive. But I had always done that within this broader set of priorities and focuses that are dictated by a parent company or whatever. So it was time. I was really drawn to the opportunity to create a firm that was purpose driven and authentic. Our objective was to bring something unique to our clients and ideally to grow to be able to address specific client needs, really building a true partnership, with them, but also to cultivate the type of culture and environment that's deeply motivating to our employees and inspiring to others. So that was really kind of what drove that leap of faith, I guess. Um, I'd say there were a few learnings along the way with that experience. The first was, and I wrote about this at one point, but being a leader in a big company is pretty different from running something of your own. When I was the CEO of Rosenberg, my prior firm, there were times when it was really lonely. You have to keep people motivated and inspired when sometimes the backdrop is challenging or when you're navigating developments that are negative or counter to what you want to achieve for your functional area, which is just a piece of a much bigger puzzle. So, I had an amazing management team. And honestly, Rosenberg was comprised of people anybody would be lucky to lead, yet I felt the full weight of that company's future. And it was often hard to distribute that weight because we had a highly tenured team. It seemed like many were facing burnout given a lot of the things that the firm had been through. So I sort of felt protective in terms of exposing them to too much. So I dealt with the challenges and then tried to keep them focused on the possibilities. Switching gears, being the founder of a firm, certainly is not for the faint of heart. And it comes with a different set of responsibilities and stresses. But when you have a team that is drawn to the mission, they're invested in every way and really, you really do feel that sense of distributed leadership where you just have confidence that everyone is rowing the boat in the same direction and will do whatever it takes to keep it on course. And that made the journey so much more enjoyable because it really felt like we're in this together. So that was a big lesson, observation, feeling. The other was that work really doesn't feel like work when you're doing something you love with people you admire and respect. We didn't really even have the concept of a traditional work week. Half the times we're trying to schedule meetings and people are like, do you realize it's Labor Day or do you realize it's Memorial Day? But we just kept going because of that feeling of sort of true ownership and that joy of collaborating, being, having our own agency, like being responsible for our own, outcomes. And I guess maybe the third would be that when you're small and nimble and the team is fully invested, that opportunity for innovation, for flexibility, for creativity really knows no bounds. And that was incredibly liberating. So, our journey didn't lead to the outcome I had hoped for, but it was the best 4 years of my career. And even if I knew the probability was high for that outcome to be the same, I would do it all over again. It was a really great experience. It's a shame it came to an end.
And how did you motivate people to bring that personal sense of accountability to the organization?
First of all, it's easy to feel motivated when you feel like you're an owner in the firm. And everyone on our team was an equity owner in the firm. So this was our business collectively. This wasn't Heidi's business that you're an employee of, and that really has, immense power to make someone feel that, not only are they able to put their fingerprint on what you're building, but it's part of what they're contributing to in their building. So we had the benefit of having very, very senior people. We sort of hand-picked the best of the best. And we were just fortunate that they were in a position where they could take that entrepreneurial leap. We didn't know that when we first reached out to the four others that became part of the team. You just never know where people are in their personal journeys, but they all decided to join. They all wanted to be equity owners in the firm, and that meant, giving up compensation in many ways because we were starting a business from scratch. It wasn't profitable, and we had to get it to a place. But from the very beginning, the energy was just palpable. People were super excited about building something, about making it really special, about really sort of thinking outside of the box. And we of course started in the middle of Zoom as well. And so we were all working, remotely at our homes, but, there were a number of things that Catherine and I really had the benefit of. One was that we'd all worked together almost 20 years at this point because we'd all been at Rosenberg the whole time effectively. So we knew each other well. There was a high level of trust and respect, and it was just easy, to work in that environment, which I know is not a luxury many people, would have. But I think, really making the effort to be very communicative, very transparent, very clear what's working, what's not working, what direction are we headed in. But importantly, it's not a one-way street. It's not me imparting all these things. It's me sharing those and then asking for input and feedback and contribution. And so really, I think at the end of the day, and I've learned this from leading teams around the world for most of my career, is that people want to add value and feel valued. And no matter where they are, what their role is, it's not just a millennial thing like a lot of people say. And that's everything from being clear on priorities and how each individual fits into that bigger picture, to recognizing milestones and accomplishments, making people feel like you're invested in their success. The other, which I already touched on, is that communication angle, really being transparent, keeping people informed, which is easier to do when it's a company that everybody is an equity owner in versus potentially a very, very large organization with hundreds of thousands of people. But that doesn't mean you can sit on your hands. You have to find a way to communicate and to make everyone feel like they understand the mission and what their role is, in that. So, I think for us, we were in part fortunate because of the people that we had and the experience and the desire to create something meaningful and make their own impact, but also what Catherine and I really tried to cultivate from a leadership and culture, standpoint. When we were building Radiant, the culture and the environment was almost as important as the services and we were trying to provide to our clients. They go hand in hand. You can't disentangle those two things. So
Now, beyond Radiant, you've also led diverse global teams. What lessons have you learned about engaging and uniting people across cultures and geographies?
I would say, in addition to the two concepts that I've already put out around communication and around making sure people are feeling valued, is that there is no one size fits all. That's what I love about working in a multicultural environment. There are so many differences. And if you can find a way to cultivate those differences, it can be incredibly, rich. But you need to meet people where they are. You need to recognize them individually. You need to seek to learn. You have to have an intellectual curiosity to understand why folks in Japan operate maybe a little bit differently than people in London. And there's, I think, a natural tendency to stereotype, and that's not what I'm talking about. It's really about seeking to understand those individuals, what makes them tick, what motivates them, what inspires them, And that, takes time. You have to build that level of trust, and that happens through communication, through interaction, but really through imparting this view that you deeply care. People are there for a reason, and we're not hiring cogs in a machine. These are people that are being brought on for their experiences and their skill sets and their perspectives. And you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't do your best to draw that out. And I feel like the more that people felt that you were invested in them, then they were invested, in you. Having teams in different offices, where we had London, Singapore, Japan at one point, some folks in Hong Kong, that is not easy. And for me, it required a lot of travel because I think Zoom has brought us great benefits in terms of hiring and expanding our perspectives as to who we can bring into an organization. But I do think that being face to face with people is really key. And so, for example, one of the things that I would regularly do is these lunch bunches. So whenever I was in any of the offices, my assistant would randomly select a group of people that I would go to lunch with as COO and then as CEO. And these might be folks that I don't normally bump into or, have day-to-day interaction with, but I had the benefit of knowing everyone in the firm, just not all that well until I was doing these lunch bunches. And then you really got to know people deeply. And frankly, the more they feel like you're genuinely interested in their point of view, you're going to learn a lot, sort of bottom up. So that's just an example of a way that I think you can engage in a multicultural sort of, global context, if that makes sense.
Well, you're listening to Expressions of Leadership. After the break, we'll dive into the challenges that Heidi's faced and how those moments have shaped her as a leader. Stay with us. We'd love for you to be a part of the Expressions of Leadership community. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and my guest today is Heidi Ridley. Heidi, let's talk about the challenges that shaped you along the way in your leadership journey. Every leader faces tough moments. Can you share a significant challenge that you've encountered in your career and how you overcame it?
Oh, 35 years, lots of challenges. I would have to say that the toughest was really at Rosenberg. I had spent nearly 2 decades of my career there, and I had joined when the firm was 14 billion. We grew to 140 billion, so it was, real successful journey. But sort of at the apex of that, we really faced an internal crisis right on the heels of the global financial crisis. So it was a bit of a double mammy coming off the GFC, and then we had a risk model error at the firm, which was really a challenge from a communication standpoint. I happened to be global head of client service, so it was my teams around the world that were really on the front lines engaging with hundreds of clients during that time. And there was a lot to it, but it was ultimately a real PR and communications disaster, coming, like I said, on the heels of the global financial crisis. It was incredibly challenging in part because I felt like I instinctively knew how I thought it should be handled, but we were dealing with a lot of inputs, most of which we had little control over. And that was frustrating. But one of the things that really caught me by surprise was that some very senior people crumbled, under the pressure. In any leadership situation, people are dependent on you. It's at the worst of the worst times when leadership really needs to show up. And you can't orchestrate from the stands or outsource your decision making. You need to lead from the front and frankly, being in the trenches, so to speak. My view is you have an incredible responsibility to your clients, to your employees, to the firm that transcends you. So it's in the most challenging of times that I think true leadership can be tested, and you can't be anything other than all in 150%. And I was. Too many people challenging me for that, by the way. But I stepped up in ways that I didn't even know I was capable of because the situation called for it. But I also observed starkly how easy it can be to crumble when the pressure's on. So, you know, I can appreciate that everyone has their own circumstances that may lead to one reaction, over another. But I have always been someone who doesn't shy away from a challenge, let alone a crisis. And I can lean into chaos and really try to bring order out of it. And so, I was really just focused on getting us through it and had no idea how it would ultimately end up. I just knew it was a great firm and an incredible group of people to which something really tragic had just occurred. But honestly, how I showed up for that, I think really led to my appointment as COO and chief of staff. And then that ultimately put me in a position to succeed as CEO of the firm. So that would be really, for many reasons, the most challenging thing I've been through in my career.
And you've been recognized as a finalist for Women of the Year in Investment Leadership twice. What does that recognition mean to you personally?
I mean, it's an honor. I think it was definitely unexpected. I investment management is a big industry, and to have your contributions in a much smaller setting be recognized more broadly is really incredible. I have always wanted to have some sort of real impact, to leave my mark, even if it's in the smallest way. So it really meant a lot.
And mentorship is also a big theme in your life. How do you approach mentoring young women in finance and technology?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to be supportive of anyone considering a career in finance and technology. I think sometimes finance can get a bit of a bad rap if we lose sight of that moral compass of really helping people, create financial stability. But we need creative thinkers. We need new ideas. We need a continued push for innovation. And I think, we can stay true to our roots in terms of creating financial stability, which sounds boring, but also be a source for greater good. And that can be really appealing to bright new minds. So, I'm always open to new conversations. Everyone's got their own circumstances. So largely the role I have played is really helping people process what might drive them specifically. Where is the interest coming from? Or maybe if they don't know anything about it, I'd love to talk to people about what it's really about. And equally, I would say lovely thing about our industry is there is a range of roles. You could be everything from a portfolio manager or an analyst to a marketing person, to someone who's really focused on sustainability. And so helping increase awareness around, all of the potential opportunities that people can tap into. Um, and the skill sets that they can bring and the aspirations they can bring has really been largely the kind of role I've played as I've talked to various different people that are considering a career or considering a next step within the career of asset management.
And what's important to you about specifically mentoring young women in these fields?
Yeah, I think, things are changing. I feel like in a good way, with women being drawn to more of the STEM, driven roles. That was not the case, when I was a lot younger. It was pretty rare, and I think we could really use a wider range of diverse perspectives from underrepresented groups. At the end of the day, there is this incredible demographic shift that's going to happen, that is actually underway, that's going to really create generational transfer of wealth and start to change the face of people who are in the position to drive investments or are in a position to create financial value for themselves. And we can't serve a constituency we don't represent ourselves. So we need to have more women, more underrepresented groups, driving, being a driving force within our industry. So women's easy. I'm one of four girls. I've had a unique experience, and I feel like I can bring a lot of value to someone who's thinking about a career in finance. But I do really want to encourage us to think more broadly about it. It's not a woke thing to do. It's about, really challenging status quo and enriching the conversations with perspectives you might not have thought about because you didn't come from that background or that schooling or that, experience.
And speaking of challenges, how did you navigate resistance that you faced in driving inclusion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say Rosenberg was so uniquely diverse and it was something we staunchly protected. So I actually grew up, at a company that was very, very diverse in terms of backgrounds, skill sets, countries, cultures, languages, education, age, all of those things. But I would say that the two types of challenges, one would be maybe top down, where perhaps senior people, have already made their minds about something and they don't really want a potentially different point of view. So, trying to continually demonstrate and highlight situations in which a different perspective or opinion added meaningfully, to the analysis may not have changed the ultimate outcome, but really certainly improved our approach to the situation. Highlighting those examples, I think, was a good way of getting people to come around to you shouldn't have a visceral negative reaction to someone not agreeing with you. You should really seek to understand where that disagreement is coming from. So there's this top down sort of element. I would say the bottom up was a little bit of my own thing because I really tried to have a lot of inclusive conversations, for example, within Rosenberg. And I remember early on, I would have these like team meetings and I would, encourage people to, I'd throw out a topic and pretty routinely, like a third of the room would be the ones most engaged and two-thirds of the room wouldn't really say a lot. And I found that very frustrating because I was like, I'm trying to create this inclusive environment. I've opened the door. Why isn't everybody jumping through it? And it was interesting. After a couple of those meetings, what I found was pretty consistently, a couple of days later, someone would come into my office and be like, hey, I was thinking about the conversation we were having and blah, blah, blah. Or I might get an email. Hey, I was thinking about, and these are my perspective. And I very quickly learned that one of the unique things we had as a diverse firm was this concept of cognitive diversity or just different ways of processing. I'm a on the fly processor. So if you come in with an issue, I'm immediately trying to solve it probably before you finish your sentence. So I have to like curtail that myself. There are others though that really have to sit with, what you've said. And that was a learning for me, that inclusion doesn't have to be the way I want to include, so it was kind of both bottom up and top down. But again, I think it requires awareness, and just, checking in with yourself and understanding what the situation requires.
Well, we've been talking about resilience and mentorship and the power of inclusion in leadership. After the break, we'll explore how Heidi balances her professional work with family and her commitment to financial literacy. By partnering with Expressions of Leadership, you'll reach an audience of professionals passionate about leadership and growth. For sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and I'm here with Heidi Ridley. Heidi, you're deeply committed to financial literacy. Why is that mission so important to you, and what impact do you hope to make?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, my personal upbringing was deeply influential. It let me experience firsthand the challenges that a difficult financial situation can bring, tangibly and emotionally. I think financial literacy is so critical because it empowers individuals to make informed decisions, about their money, and it helps people achieve financial independence and well-being through being educated, about it. And I continue to be honestly surprised at how little focus there is on financial literacy in schools at a young age. I mean, I mentioned the project my seventh grade teacher gave us. That was so rare. And it was my English teacher. Like, it was not a financial or economic class. But honestly, that one project instilled in me a discipline in growing up, like literally going through high school and college to catalog what I was making in various jobs and what my debts were and finding ways to like balance the two, at a minimum, not to get, overextended. So, yeah, that meant I had, three jobs at one point after college just to stay on top of it. But had I dug a big hole at the outset, that would have been incrementally harder to get out of. So I try my best to be a voice for it at a minimum. I have also tried to influence local schools to consider adding courses to their curriculum, even if it's just an elective. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. I really hope to make a more tangible impact, over time. It's super important for us as a society, as a country.
I couldn't agree more. Now let's turn to your home life. You mentioned the importance of family in your life. Your husband, four boys, daughters-in-law, and even a grandson. How has being part of a big family influenced your leadership style?
Well, the sarcastic in me was you definitely have to find your voice. But they all know I have a loud one, so that's not a good answer. I think it's definitely been additive. I always have hoped to be a strong role model at home in the same way that I want to be a strong role model at work. And just like in a work context, there are multiple constituents in my personal life, as you mentioned, a daughter, as an older sister, as an aunt, as a wife, a mom-in-law, now a grandma. But I also have a couple of unique things going on. The first is that I was raised as the oldest of four girls in very different circumstances than I found myself trying to raise four boys. And I happen to work in the same field, as you mentioned, as my husband. We actually met at work, which is a bit unusual. So I've learned the hard way that trying to take my upbringing and impart it on teenage boys doesn't exactly go down. And I've tried to take my work management style and, finesse it with my husband, and that doesn't always fly. So, stepping back, I think I really try to embody and emulate similar attributes in all situations. I'm all about that sort of consistency. So, honesty, empathy, trustworthiness, having a strong work ethic and being dependable. This attitude that giving up is not an option, that there's always a solution. So you have to cultivate a problem-solving mindset. And I probably have one to a fault. Like it's hard for me to take no for an answer. I'm like, what about this? But relatedly, nothing is going to break you unless you let it. So, being resilient in the face of adversity and seeing change as opportunity is really a phenomenal trait. Being simultaneously independent, but also able to rely on each other and work as a team and have, something we talked about earlier, respect for differences of opinion, and having actually, open conversations can be really enriching. So, in all candor, the imparting of those values to people really close to you where emotions run deep can be more challenging than in a work context, which is a little less personal. So I would say the intention is the same. And I've learned that nuances matter deeply, and I can certainly wear my emotions on my sleeves. So being more consistent in my delivery, or rather less emotional and more level-headed with situations that involve my family, is definitely a work, in progress. But I don't know. I mean, I think in the end, authenticity is always at the core. I can't pretend to be something to my kids that I'm not, and I can't pretend to be something at work that I'm not. But they definitely co-influence in really good ways.
Well, we're going to take a brief pause, and when we come back, we'll look ahead to her vision and the future and the legacy that Heidi hopes to leave. True transformation starts from within. The Forward Project partners with organizations to create meaningful culture shifts and develop leaders who inspire real change. If your team is ready to move forward with purpose, visit www.theforwardproject.co. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and my guest today is Heidi Ridley. Heidi, let's now turn toward the future, your vision for leadership and the legacy ultimately that you want to create. If you look ahead 10 to 15 years, what's your vision for the future of asset management and leadership and finance?
Well, in many ways, I think the mission should never change, which is to deliver the best results for our clients, and to do so in in a manner that I think is consistent with what's expected of us. I mean, we are ultimately stewards of other people's money, and we have to do the best we can for the people who trust us with their financial livelihoods. So. I mentioned before that in this next decade, we have this massive generational transfer of wealth. Well, that's intersecting with a world that's changing dramatically in how we evaluate companies, the standards that we set. On top of that, you have incredible advancements in data and technology, the implications of which we're still grappling with. Deborah spoke quite a bit about that on your podcast with her. The key is continually challenging ourselves to evolve in ways that best serve our clients in a dynamically changing environment, to keep pushing the envelope, recognizing that status quo will not ultimately lead to success. And that may not sound particularly groundbreaking, but the reality is that firms that are successful tend to rest on their laurels and almost resist change. Why mess with something that isn't broken? There's almost this view that if we've met with success, that recipe never needs to be altered. And the reality is that, 20, 30 years ago, maybe, you just need to deliver good performance and establish a few, solid relationships, and that's all it took. But the pace of disruption has accelerated, and we're dealing with new technologies, new insights, a changing workforce, challenges to the norms of a typical work environment. And the world isn't not going to do you the favor of standing still. So you need to be adaptable, embracing technology, focusing on how your people keep you one step ahead. So I guess my vision for the future is leaning into change and innovation, resting less on past success and pushing toward the next wave. And the leadership that is required for that is open, communicative, flexible, being an agent for positive change. I mean, that's really what we had been trying to do with Radiant, but Radiant is so small that, my vision is that the entire industry starts to really embrace that.
What's one assumption about the future of leadership that you think we'll look back on and realize we got this wrong?
That promoting diversity is a woke thing. Genuinely. I cannot believe where we are, not even in our industry in general. It's definitely not reflective of the workforce and the constituencies that we look to serve. And I think telling ourselves that by bringing in underrepresented groups and allowing them to have a role of impact within the industry is somehow degrading the type of skill set and experience. I really hope that narrative goes by the wayside. I felt like we were starting to make real progress several years ago, and really having incredible contribution. I mean, what we need to realize is this is about growing the whole pie. This isn't about stealing slices of the pie for different constituents. And I think, that's something that we will certainly look back on and regret, coming to a standing halt and then sliding backwards at a time where we're making incremental progress at best.
As you said, it's about making that pie bigger for everyone. And I believe that the abundant mindset is what will free us from that limited belief that there are only so many spaces for women at the top.
Yes.
That creates this scarcity mentality. So women that are in those positions feel like they have to guard their spots. But with an abundant mentality, we ask instead, who says that there are only so many spaces for women at the top? How can we make more room for women and create more opportunities for women to lead in senior positions?
And I completely agree. I mean, this is not a zero-sum game.
And when you think about your own career and your life, what legacy do you hope to leave for your industry, your family, and even the next generation of leaders?
I feel like I've got so much more to do before thinking about a legacy. My ambition for a legacy when I launched Radiant, when I left Rosenberg to launch Radiant, was really to pave the way for more women and underrepresented groups in our industry to see that, there's a firm that can be successful that is entirely made up of a diverse, group of people, and potentially be a home for those, voices. But um, in terms of, you know, impactful legacy, I still think I've got another chapter to hopefully be able to bring some positive impact to our industry. But I do hope that from a leadership standpoint, I've already left a bit of a mark in terms of just being a different leader. Really being deeply caring about the people that work with me and for me. Being that person that's very authentic, accessible, which is very rare for people in senior roles. Wanting them to feel that they're at that firm for a reason, that they're there to contribute, and therefore I want to hear, their points of view, and that I'll give them consideration. And at the end of the day, that they'll leave thinking, if I ever want to emulate someone as a leader, it's Heidi. I mean, that would be huge.
Well, we're going to take one final break. And after we come back, we'll wrap up with some wisdom, a little whimsy, and Heidi's parting reflections. Don't miss a thing. Follow Expressions of Leadership on your favorite podcast app and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and we're closing our conversation with Heidi Ridley with some wisdom and some whimsy. But before we move into the final questions, I'd love for listeners to know how they can follow your work. So, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
At the moment, I do have a website up, so HeidiRidley.com, but the easiest way would probably be LinkedIn. Also, just Heidi Ridley, no numbers.
So, let's get into our wisdom and our whimsy segment of the show. And let's start with, of course, the advice question. If you could design a leadership course for the future, what would be its first lesson?
So, great question. In my mind, there are three characteristics that truly great leaders embody. I mean, there's many, but there are three that kind of, if I had to synthesize it down: authenticity, curiosity, and adaptability. So I would approach a leadership course by trying to build a foundation for cultivating those attributes. So when you think of authenticity, being your honest and true self, being accessible, as I mentioned, operating with integrity, building relationships, and being someone people trust, but to be authentic also means you have to have humility. So by design, it's rare that a leader's going to know everything, every department, every detail. There are leaders that have a lot of breadth, and there are those who are specialists, with a lot of depth. But acknowledging that you can't possibly be the foremost expert in everything is both liberating for you and empowering, to others. So that's the way I think about kind of the authenticity bucket. Curiosity to me is about having a mindset that things can always be improved, constantly challenging yourself and learning, never resting on your laurels. What haven't we thought of? It also means you have to be open to new ideas and willing to challenge yourself to sort of think differently. And then when I think about adaptability, it encompasses not only a willingness to change, but to anticipate it. But it also means perseverance, which to me is both resilience and drive. So, I think one of the things I often remind myself of is that leadership very often operates in ambiguity. Whether it's the markets that are, out of our control, changing themes, what have you, and you're not going to have all the answers. But if your people trust you and know your true intentions are for the greater good, that you're open to a broader set of perspectives and acknowledge that there's always a solution and have the courage to sort of see things through, the chance of a success is really within reach. So the course to me would be, how can we get people to meditate on building those capabilities within themselves so that when the technical skills are there, they can draw on those soft skills to amplify their impact? Great leaders often have technical skills, but not always. Case in point, great leaders always have, always embody and emulate these soft skills that sort of transcend industry. So it would be about maybe building the right instincts. Certainly would be a fun class to construct.
And how would you go about helping them to build these kinds of instincts?
That's a very good question. Self-meditation is the first way to. I did a program when I was chief of staff at Rosenberg, where we were really focused on, there had been sort of a gap between the senior leadership and then the next level. Very talented, good instincts and all that, but we knew we had to invest in bridging that gap so that there were natural succession candidates. And so I got this group, this next generation group, sort of together. And it started out with reading that fable, like the Five Temptations of a CEO or something like that. And then we did a self-reflection exercise where people, were very open about their strengths, their weaknesses, where they see them. Weaknesses aren't always obvious. So one way to think about it is, when do you find yourself shutting down, like in a conversation or in a meeting? Is there something that's turning that off to you that can get you to tap into that? And so a bit of self-reflection around where you think, maybe you're one of those three things is a real strong suit. So it would take some, questioning of internal capabilities, ideally a 360 process, because we don't always observe about ourselves with what others might observe about us. And then really digging deep. And that's why I try to define kind of each of those things. What does adaptability really mean? What does curiosity really mean? And then having some exercises that really hopefully would help challenge your capability to do those things, even if they're reflective. Like in this scenario, how would you handle it? Here might be a different, way. Again, that's off on the fly, but I love doing things like the Enneagram and, all these different things. And just, I've learned a lot in my career, actually, about learning about the person that you work with. So I found myself, this is a little bit of tangent, but I found myself sometimes being incredibly frustrated. Like I would go into the CEO at the time and want a resolution on something, and I wasn't getting it. And I was like, what? And I remember during that crisis that I mentioned, we actually had an executive coach for all of us. And I remember, imparting my frustration about the situation. And it turned out that this particular coach was also a coach for the CEO with whom I was interacting, and was like, the way he processes is this way. He needs to do this, that, and the other thing. Once I knew that, it completely changed our dynamic, because now I knew how to speak to him in a way that he would receive it. I was speaking to him the way I would receive it and I would react. And so just that kind of openness and reflection around, we're different people, we come at things differently, and how do we find a way to communicate to one another to bring the best, out of each other?
I find that in a lot of the work that I do, that self-awareness is really the key to unlocking greatness when it
Yeah.
comes to leadership. Because when they know what is going on internally, then they can be much more intentional about how they
Yeah.
respond in situations, how they communicate, versus just being reactive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on that point, I've done so many 360s, like it was required by the parent company and stuff like that. I was always like, bring it on. Like I welcomed it. I can't tell you how many people are like, oh, I do not want the 360. It's like, what are you afraid of? Because at the end of the day, If people are thinking it and you don't know it, you have no opportunity to change that perception. So I would rather know. I always applauded people who would come in and be like, "Hey, did I do something wrong?" And I'd be like, "What are you talking about?" I was so glad they came in because they had, in that case, a misperception about, how I was reacting to something. And had they not said anything, they would have stewed on it for forever. So this idea that you can be open to receiving constructive feedback. I'm not the greatest at it because I don't like negative things about me because I really try to do the best job I can. But if it needs to be framed the right way. But I think that's just an opportunity for self improvement. That's an opportunity for you to be a better you. Why would you not want that? It's just fascinating to me, actually, about human behavior.
And what's the best piece of feedback, positive or maybe critical, that stuck with you and shaped your leadership?
Being an A-type personality, I'm going to go to critical first. But and this might help folks. I mean, early in my career, really early in my career, I was an executive assistant to the CEO of an asset management arm of an investment bank. So big personalities. And I'd have to chase down things for him for from various parts of the organization. I was in my very early 20s and still a bit insecure. In a totally new field naturally. And so a reliable fallback was Stephen wants it. Like Stephen needs this, Stephen wants this, And at some point he called me in and said that approach wasn't really going to serve me well, in the long run. And he really encouraged me to try to develop my own credibility in relationships so that people wanted to do things for me because I needed them, not because I was just a mouthpiece for somebody else. And it really stuck with me because it was the first bit of really critical feedback. I mean, when the CEO calls you in and it's like, we need to talk, that I got in the industry, and an industry I desperately wanted to do well in. But because it was also right, it was really good advice. It's a challenge for a young new entrant into any field, but it's achievable if you come into it with, I've got to have my own, agency. I can't just be the shepherd for whatever this person, wants. So that would be the critical one. Positive would just be, I still have people reach out to me now. I'm still deeply close to so many people at Montgomery and at Rosenberg. Um, and just the feeling that I made a difference in their careers, in their lives and how they felt about work. That's just deeply meaningful to me.
Well, now it's time for our final fun question. What is your favorite holiday of the year and why?
Definitely Thanksgiving. When I was growing up, my parents were gone a lot. My mom was working, my dad was working, and we rarely had dinner together actually. But Thanksgiving, we had dinner together. And it became a very meaningful thing that I didn't really realize until later in life, where I sort of took over being the host of Thanksgivings. I've hosted every year, and it's something that I really love. But just that family gathering. I mean, you mentioned earlier, I'm deeply connected to my family. I just, fiercely love them. And so this idea of togetherness, that you know, one holiday where I feel like people really go out of their way, to be together. And it's, the time of year when it's fall, leaves are changing. I love that time of year. My birthday happens to be in November, but Thanksgiving for me just says like togetherness, gratefulness, embracing the beauty and change. It's like nurturing the soul to me.
Well, Heidi, thank you for joining us on Expressions of Leadership and offering your insights and your experiences from pioneering ESG investing to mentoring the next generation and embracing life with such a fun and adventurous spirit. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I've just had a blast.
And thank you to our listeners. We appreciate you being with us today. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend or follow and subscribe. And stay tuned for more conversations with inspiring leaders from all walks of life. Until next time, lead boldly and live fully. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click on that follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes. Have a guest you'd like us to interview? Questions, ideas, or just want to say hello? You can reach us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com or connect with us on Instagram or YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks to our amazing team behind the scenes for making this podcast possible, including our sound engineer, Graham Palmer, and my chief encourager and advisor, Jeremiah Higgins.